Charles's work in developing taxonomies of behaviour change, in intervention mapping and models of behaviour change. Charles has held several scientific advisor positions in the UK Department of Health, the UK National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and the UK House of Lords. And he was named on a list of 100 practicing scientists, a list of 100 leading practicing scientists in the UK, according to the UK Science Council. He is now at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where he is director of the New Melbourne Centre for Behaviour Change. So clearly there's a lot of commonalities in the work that we do and a lot of shared interests and experiences as well. So today Charles is going to be talking to us about making behaviour change research useful, and in particular how we maximise our practical relevance and our impact, which is very close to our hearts, and I think we'll be eagerly taking a lot of notes today. So please join me in welcoming Charles, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. As you know, as of this month, I'm setting up this group to work in the School of Psychology and the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And our job will be to try and develop behaviour change research and intervention and evaluations that will improve healthcare delivery. So I kind of see you guys as like, you're already doing this stuff, and I just arrived and I've got to learn how to do it. So I'm very keen to meet you and hope that we may be able to collaborate, because it does seem that our core interests are very similar, even if our core topics are slightly different. So in talking about what I should say to introduce myself, we thought I should emphasize that although this talk is not going to be about sustainable development, it is something that I'm very interested in. Samuel Chung is one of my more recent PhD students, as is Kristen Hoffman. And Ben Gardner was one of my PhD students quite some time ago. He's now a real expert in habit and automaticity. And in particular, we've done work in looking at transportation in cities, how you can transform that and make it workable and sustainable, which Sam works in Singapore now, and that's a very interesting context in which to look at city transportation, because Singapore has a lot of control over its city compared to many other cities. But equally, I think it's an interesting topic if you're driving around Melbourne as to how Melbourne could become a more sustainable and transport-friendly city. And in fact, I think some of the people in Sam's unit have been advising people in Melbourne as well. So it's a small world. But this is something I'm particularly interested in. But I'm not going to talk about any of this. We decided it'd be better to talk about behaviour change research more generally. So I'm going to make a few points about how we can make behaviour change research useful, and talk a little bit about some of the things I'm doing in relation to that. And in particular, then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about this whole idea of what are taxonomies of change techniques for, and how can we apply them. So I'll talk about scaling up a bit, and here I feel slightly embarrassed because I think you guys are probably doing this and already know this, so this will be quite brief. I'm going to talk about the whole idea of being very specific about behaviours, because I think that's often the trick, that if you can really identify the behavioural generation and maintenance, that's how you know where to intervene effectively, and that sometimes that's done too superficially to understand the process and models that we need. I'm going to talk about rigorous evaluation, process evaluation, because I think that's very important. The use of experimental evidence in defining mechanisms and techniques. I'll say a little bit about reporting, and that's a bit of a pessimistic part of the talk. I think we have real problems in our science around reporting, and I am very keen to collaborate with people who want to improve that. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about this whole idea of categorizing mechanisms and techniques and how to do that in a way that enhances the applicability of our research. So, as I say, I think you guys are probably already doing this, but it's quite a big problem in our area that when you look across, say, like healthy eating or any other kind of behavioral domain, there's a lot of evidence to look at, but there's relatively few randomized control field studies to draw on. And if you start with that kind of bar as that's where the evidence is, you end up having very few studies to look at in lots of areas. So there is a problem about doing studies that show effect at scale. And yeah, I worked with Baroness Julia Neuberger on this committee. It published in 2011, a long time ago. But I mention it because I'm concerned, I suppose, that if we did this again today, that it might not be as positive as we might hope, you know, more or less a decade on. So these are two of the 32 recommendations that the committee made. And the first one is essentially that actually government can't use a lot of this research, because the idea of this committee's work was to say, okay, you guys know how to change behavior. We want to change behavior. Criminal justice, health, transport, you know, this is our business. Come and tell us how to do it. And in fact, the conclusions are very disappointing that a lot of the research that was brought to the committee was not deemed to be useful at that kind of population scale. And that a lot of the evaluation was not robust enough to be taken seriously. So we had a lot of researchers who were invited into the committee and presented their evidence on weight loss, recycling, criminal behavior, et cetera, and by and large, the committee decided, well, this is all very interesting. It'd be great if this was developed so we could use it. So that's a challenge, I think, to people in our area. How can we actually produce things where governments are going to look at it and go, we want that, that's good. And I think that that is a big challenge for all of us. And of course, it requires us to work with real world systems and to be doing very rigorous evaluations within those systems, for example, in trying to transform health services. So it's a hard challenge, but I think it's something that really needs to be borne in mind. I think one of the kind of questions around all that is, where do you focus your attention? So a lot of the time, does this work? No, that's great. So a lot of the time we're doing this. We're saying, okay, look, here's a person. How can we help them change their behavior? But that may not be the best way to change behavior. While the UK, for example, is still in the EU, in fact, passing legislation in Brussels may be a better way to change, let's say, farmers' behavior than running persuasive campaigns. So the level at which we intervene is very important, and I've just mentioned this protocol here. It's work I'm collaborating with John Toumborough at Deakin University on, and he's interested in reducing alcohol consumption amongst teenagers, people under the age of 18. But in fact, the intervention operates at a community and organizational level. He's not targeting individuals. He's trying to change, for example, how bowl shops practice and how schools and parent organizations practice. So by starting here, he's trying to change behavior at this level. And I think that's often an important question when we're designing things. Where in this model should we be starting? And I think sometimes if we start here, we have much less impact than if we start further up. But I'm not saying any of that's easy, because it takes a lot of political negotiation to get, for example, a health provider to agree to let you work at these higher levels. Okay, Moving on then, the specificity of behaviors I think is very important. So I'll just kind of mention a few pointers here. This is by Rachel McKeachin, Mark Connor and colleagues. And this is derived from one of their papers, this paper. And it's just kind of a whole series of variables along which behavior patterns might differ. And I just mention it because I think that thinking about the behavior like this before you do anything else can be very helpful. So when people come to me and say, this is what we want to change, my first meeting is all about talking about the behavior, how it's generated and how it's maintained and what it's like, you know. Do the people know this? What's their view on this? You know, so you've got a really kind of good description of the behavior before you start, because if you don't have that, you may make assumptions that, oh, that kind of behavior is regulated by, let's say, fear. So we will use a fear arousal technique, for example, but that might be really misguided in terms of what actually generates the behavior. So it's a very simple point. I'm just going to focus on one aspect of this, which is the whole idea of habit and automaticity, because again, I think this is very, I think it's under studied in relation to behavior change work. That I'll come to a different model in a moment, but there's assumption about, well, if you give people information, you motivate them, you give them skills, they'll go out and do it, and then they don't. And why is that? Well, it's because, I mean, social psychologists talk about us as cognitive misers. That is that on a daily basis, we try not to change anything. So from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to bed, what you want is routines that are predictable and take very little energy or thought. So if our behavior is very automatic in that kind of way, then how you change it needs to take account of how you can disrupt automaticity at a number of levels. So this paper by Stack and Deutsch, I think, is a really good introduction to the area. But Ron, who's joined us just this month in our small group, has written this absolutely excellent book, which is, I think, the state-of-the-art discussion of the difference between consciously monitored, executive system regulated behavior patterns versus what Ron calls operating system or habitual behaviors. And his book highlights the way in which these two systems operate. And I'll say a little bit about that in a moment, but I think it's a kind of really critical starting point, because if you're trying to change these kind of behaviors, then operating through this system may only get you so far. So dual process models are a useful place to start in terms of specifying behavior. And we know all this. I'm not suggesting that you don't already know all this, but, you know, kind of making and breaking habits, mindless behavior patterns, like I like this 1.6 term, mindless eating, are very important. There was a really good clip from an episode of Frasier, which I don't know if you're all too young to know this American sitcom, but Frasier's a psychiatrist, and in this episode he asks a woman, what's so good about smoking? But he's thinking that, you know, she's going to say, yeah, it's horrible and don't take it up. But what she says is, everything's good about smoking. When I get a new packet and I feel the cellophane, I already get excited. And then when I tear the cellophane, well, that's really great. And then I open it and I smell the cigarettes, and so on. And what you see later in this episode is that Frasier, his brother Niles, and their housekeeper Daphne are all caught smoking in the toilet, on the balcony, whatever, because they're all ex-smokers. And what she has done is remind them of these long-term reward systems which they have built up as smokers. So the automaticity works not just at the behavioral level, but very much at the perceptual level, the cognitive appraisal level, and the regulatory level. That what you do in order to kind of, do I go into the donut shop or do I not? That's also automatic or habitual. So at all these levels, you have automatic processes working, which your conscious control of may be relatively limited and may take a lot of effort to reprogram. So I think that's quite an important kind of issue that I feel I'm often struggling with. This is David Kessler's book, and I really like this book. It's obviously a failed intervention because overeating didn't end in 2009, but nonetheless, he talks about, you know, how do you go through this process from regarding, you know, let's say chocolate bars as lovely, tempting snacks that you must have to make yourself feel better, to this kind of description of the same food, which elicits a kind of disgust. So how do you move from that, from one to the other? Because if you move to the point where this is taken from one of his participants, where somebody's actually describing food in that way, they have clearly reconstructed their perception and their emotional responses to the cue that, you know, kind of was part of their overeating. So how do you do it? And he talks about these different stages, which I think is very helpful. And I really like this idea of recognition of premonitionary cues. So that's like the moment when you see a temptation and you decide to turn away or not. So you go, oh, just this time, or oh, it's Friday, or, you know, and all those instantaneous kind of thoughts are further developing the automaticity of the response at a perceptual and emotional level before you do anything. You can be standing outside the donut shop and you're already undoing your behavior change programming or not. And so helping people do this cognitive emotional response to cues that have become very automatic, I think is a big part of what we're doing, particularly if you're thinking about eating, alcohol use, and a whole range actually of behaviors that impact on people's health. So I think this is important. This is a paper I really like. It's by Alison Duckworth, and she's comes from the emotional regulation field, and it's quite salient at the moment because James Gross is giving talks in Melbourne and has been giving talks in our school. So this, you might be kind of familiar with, this emotional regulation kind of model, thinking about when you intervene. Do you intervene in terms of changing the situation so that, you know, you're not in that situation anymore, which people talk about, say, in terms of stimulus control, you know, kind of don't have the donuts in your house kind of thing? Or is it that, you know, the situation is selected, but you have a different kind of take on it? The donuts are in the attic or whatever. Or is it about how you deploy attention? Or is it about how you make evaluations? Or is it about, you know, your responses? And these cycles are very fast, kind of potentially instantaneous around cues in our environment. And she's arguing that we can think about various strategies for impulse control in terms of whether they're focused on the situation or whether they're cognitively focused, whether they're self-deployed or whether they're imposed by others. And it's quite an inspirational model. I mean, the problem about it, not to be too critical of it, but the problem is that because it has such a sweep, it's rather imprecise in some of the categorizations that it makes. But I mention it really because I think this specification of regulation is quite critical to behavior change, and that a lot of behavior change work kind of ignores the detail of this kind of control process, and therefore may not give people the tools they need to be doing this moment-to-moment intervention. Okay, I'm going to move on and talk about evaluation. I think this bit might be kind of fairly obvious. So this is intervention mapping. I kind of get no commission for mentioning it, but I think it's a really good foundational process, both for designing and evaluating behavior change interventions and for training people in behavior change research. So I'm an honorary chair at the University of Maastricht, where they run training programs in this, and I think this book is a really helpful book. And these are some of the work that we've done applying intervention mapping. This is my list of 10 tasks that I use in designing behavior change interventions, designing and evaluating, I should say. And these 10 tasks are basically derived from the intervention mapping framework. So it seems to me I'm always having to try and do these kind of things when I engage in behavior change research. And some of them take a lot longer than others, depending on the particular problem. But if we just focus for the moment on tasks 4 and 5 here, these are about the specificity of what it is we need to do to bring about change. So I'll talk a little bit about how I do some of this work, I suppose. So yeah, so you all know what a logic model is, yeah? Yeah, so I won't, okay, not everybody. Okay, so a logic model is a theory of the intervention, so it specifies what's in the intervention. So it's not a theory more generally, it's a description of exactly what the intervention's supposed to do. So this, for example, is a logic model. It's not a great logic model, but it highlights what it is that you're trying to change. And the important part here is that it highlights mechanisms whereby you might need to intervene to solve that problem. And then it highlights what the outcomes are that are going to be in your evaluation. And the importance of these, I think, is about the specificity of mechanism and about the measurement of mechanism, because it's all very well to change a behavior and show, look, the behavior is different over there. But in my view, our science will only progress if we also show how we did that. That is, what is the mechanism that we targeted and changed? And that's what a process evaluation is. An outcome evaluation might assess these, but a process evaluation would assess whether these changes occurred. And therefore, you can reasonably say, I succeeded in changing this behavior through this means, which I think is the basis of our science. So process evaluation typically investigate the mechanisms, hence the process model. We also look at fidelity of delivery, because you can design an intervention, but actually, let's say there were 10 sessions, the practitioners who were delivering it might only do 5 of them. And even then, the 5 might not be exactly what you wanted. So low fidelity means that the intervention wasn't delivered as designed. It might still work, that would be good, but you've got a difference between per protocol delivery and real-world delivery, which needs to be assessed in your process evaluation. And process evaluation can also identify problems, things that might have had negative effects. So process evaluation is very helpful when you're thinking, well, how could I improve this to scale up? And I think that our science probably doesn't do enough of this in terms of advancing behavior change intervention design. And this is, I think, a useful set of guidelines that came out from the UK Medical Research Council. It's not awfully detailed, but it's just a kind of guideline as to how you can do process evaluations, which I think is quite useful. Okay, so talking about these mechanisms then, this is a model I often use. I think it's helpful. It comes from Fisher and Fisher's work in HIV prevention, but I think it's quite helpful talking to people who are interested in doing behavior change, because it's easy to relate to. And it's a very simple model and by no means complete, but there is a question about whether people need more information, and sometimes they do. If you don't know your house is filling up with radon gas, and somebody tells you it is, and they say, by the way, it's easy to buy a kit to test it, you can see quite good behavior change on the basis of giving people information where there's a very easy response and the information relates to important life goals for them. So information is definitely important, but sometimes it's not the problem at all. So look, this is a bit of a risk question. How many of you know the answers to all three of these questions? Here's somebody who doesn't know the answer to all three, but come on, some of you do know the answer to all three of these questions. Come on, put your hand up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, no. Let's go ballpark. So we have one person here who's willing to say yes. Okay, okay, put your hands up for people who think they can answer all three of these questions. Okay, let's maybe kind of not half. So look, you guys are the best people in the world to ask these questions to. You're behavior change experts. So my point is, if you can't answer these questions, what chance has the person out there in the cafe? So that means that if you put calorie labeling on food, it's almost useless. I mean, it's accurate information. You know, this chocolate bar contains 300 calories. But unless you can answer all three of these questions, that doesn't really help you very much. So it's therefore unsurprising that putting calories on menus, the research in the US, for example, is disappointing because the information is not helpful. So what could we do instead? So there are a number of people doing this kind of research, and I'm doing it as well, collaborating with Pascal Sharon and the University of North Carolina. We call the research Calories Are Walking Times. And the idea is very simple. Can you give energy density information in a different way that's more salient to people and more usable? And the answer, I think, is yes. So here's a few findings. So I should just say, obviously this is high energy dense and that's low. So you can divide foods into low, medium, and high energy density, and then you can ask people to think about the energy contained in the food. And of course, the implicit message here is that if you consume this food and you don't use that energy, then you may generate new fat cells. So what happens if you compare asking people about walking times versus calories, yeah? And here's what you get. Well, no matter which you ask, for low-calorie foods, people tend to overestimate the amount of energy in the food. So people look at the salad and they think, well, there's quite a lot of energy there, when in fact there isn't. And in fact, the same for medium. But the real problem is here. When you ask people about high-energy foods, no matter how you ask the question, people radically underestimate the amount of energy in donuts, wine, whatever. So they are really miscalculating the amount of energy that they're consuming when they're consuming these foods. Interestingly, though, walking times leads to overestimates here, but less underestimates here, and these are significant differences. So from a health promotion point of view, it's not that they're getting the right answers, but the answers they're giving will be better in terms of their regulation than if we give, if they think about calories. So this is a very simple study, and we're doing a series of these where we're looking at what does it matter and how does it affect people if you give them different kinds of information. And I think that's very important in terms of a lot of health promotion, that the type of information people receive is not the information that's useful to them.
I was just wondering if you're measuring impact on physical activity in these groups as well?
Well, in these studies we're not, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, is it going to make them think, well, that's a lot of walking, I can't possibly do that, sorry.
Well, let me come to that, but let me also say, and the evidence I think is quite clear, if you're helping people regulate their weight, you're better focusing on both eating and physical activity rather than either. So yes, you're right that people really need to be thinking about energy deficits and energy surpluses. Because part of the problem is, even if you have small surpluses every day, over a couple of years, you're actually putting on quite a lot of weight. So, you know, that's a very important point. So here are some approaches to food labeling. So one of my interests is, which of these kind of approaches is useful? And my view is, when I go into a supermarket, even if I bring my large magnifying glass, it's just not helpful to me to look at food labeling. It's too detailed, like this kind of thing, and I don't use it. And yet, if I'm not using it, who else is using it? So would it be more helpful to, for example, it would take 42 minutes walking and 22 jogging to use the same amount of energy as in this food product? Well, maybe, but the truth is hardly anybody jogs. The level of physical activity in the population is startlingly low. So telling people it'll take 22 minutes if you jog is only going to be relevant to a tiny number of people. So maybe the only thing you need to put is that. That's the number of minutes walking it's going to take for you to use the energy in that food product. And my view is that actually this kind of labeling might make a lot of difference to people's choices. So that's, what's the point there? The point is that actually when you're giving people information, you really need to know what they know and how they're going to use the information in order to design it so that it would have an impact on motivation. So motivation, I'm not going to say much about this because I'm sure you know as much as me about it. I quite like this model of Fishbein's sort of theory, plan, behavior type model, but it's kind of just a series of things you need to think about if you're thinking about motivation. If people have low confidence in completing a behavior, they're very unlikely to persist with it. Social norms are very important. In fact, quite a lot of data points to the conclusion that for young people, if you just tell them, people who you like and people like you are doing this, that's all you need to say. It doesn't matter what the consequences or anything. Everybody's doing it. That's all you need to say. So we should be using that if we're trying to help young people regulate their behavior. And positive emotional reactions are very important too. If you're trying to promote condoms amongst young men, how do you do it? How do you say, look, use it, you'll feel better? Well, there are ways of doing it. We've, for example, looked at things like anticipated regret. Think about how you feel the next morning. So affective forecasting can actually help you bring emotional consequences into the present. But that's very important. So people who jog know that it makes them feel better. People who don't have that image of jogging. That's something you have to learn if you're going to do it. So these are quite important, I think, starting points when you're thinking about motivation. This is a study by Pascal Sheeran and colleagues, which I really like. It's a meta-analysis that only used studies that measured the mechanism and the behavioral and the motivation. So if an intervention changed attitude, social norms, or self-efficacy, did it then have an effect on motivation and behavior? And the answer from this meta-analysis is really clear. The answer is yes. So if you change these underlying elements of motivation, you have a good chance of changing motivation and behavior. So we should be targeting these, and we need to measure whether we're successful in targeting them if we're to build a science in this area. So that seems kind of rather simple, really. But here's a study we did a long time ago, and we looked at nationally available leaflets in Germany and the UK that were promoting condom use. And we asked, what's the messages that are included in them? And what you find here, this came from this publication, and some of the terms are not terms I'd use, like, for example, other people's attitudes is what I would call social norms. But what you see in blue here is the messages in the leaflets, and what you see in red is the extent of the correlation of that construct, let's say attitudes or norms, with condom use. And what you see is the things that are being targeted are perceived severity, perceived acceptability, knowledge, yeah? And nobody says it's not a good thing to do. But even if you're really successful, the impact on motivation and behavior is much lower than if you can change social norms or motivation. And yet, here, the number of messages is poorer, particularly here in terms of social norms. So what you see here is the evidence isn't being translated into the design of the health promotion. I just put this up. This is Lewis Elliott's work. He's one of our PhD students. This has nothing to do with health. It's actually about walking. No, you can't read this, but these categories refer to the ones that you can read here. And the point is that we looked at these leaflets and said, well, what are the messages in these leaflets? But in order to do that, we needed really quite a sophisticated coding system to look at these really simple leaflets. This is what we needed to fully categorize what was in them. And then you can begin to say, well, some leaflets, you know, focused on information provision and self-efficacy enhancement, others didn't. And then you can begin to do this work to ask, well, given the messages in the leaflet, what would we expect to change?
So I have the leaflet that's 17,000 words.
That's a big leaflet. I mean, you know, it's an outlier, and it's like, but yeah. I can't remember. But anyway, I must check that actually, but yeah, I'll look up the paper later today. It's a good question, but I think it does. But anyway, but you can see a lot of them are very short by comparison, yeah? What's the point here? That actually looking at in detail about what is being targeted is very important to understanding how you can bring about change. So I worked here with Amelia Lake and James Spate and others at the Australian Centre for Behaviour Research in Diabetes here in Melbourne. And here we designed a leaflet to promote recently diagnosed diabetics to take eye tests. And every component, every symbol and every line was designed in accordance with the preliminary work we'd done on what people believed and thought about these kind of tests. So I'm not saying this is incredibly successful, but I'm saying you can design things in a very detailed way if you start with these mechanisms. I'm not going to say much about behavioral skills. There are obviously many types of behavioral skills, but it is an important point that sometimes people just don't have the skills. A particular group of skills are these self-regulatory skills where people self-monitor and self-regulate. And some people are very good at this and some people less good. So if people don't have these kind of skills, we can help them develop them. But of course, motor and social skills are also very important to most behavior change. So this, for example, is a review that one of our PhD students, Sam Van Burden, led, where we looked at what kind of techniques are used to target automaticity of eating. So let's say mindless eating. What kind of things have people done in the literature? And this is a kind of map we came up with. Out of 93 studies, we had 17 categories, and some of them had evidence that's encouraging, like if-then planning, sometimes called implementation intention formation, mostly because Peter Gollwitzer is German. But, you know, here's some things that people are doing that might be effective. So here's a study we did a long time ago. Alex Luchinska led this. It's for women who are coming along to Weight Watchers, now rebranded, of course. But did we offer these people more information? No. These are people who can look at an avocado and go 32.3 points or whatever. They don't need a lot more information. Are they motivated? Well, they're coming to these classes, so probably not. So all we did is we randomly gave them one session in which we taught them how to do if-then planning. Why do your intentions become derailed? Or what stops you getting started? Why does it become derailed? And then we helped them make plans. We taught them how to do planning in one session. So Weight Watchers does indeed work. My problem with Weight Watchers is it seems to be a model of chronic illness as opposed to behavior change, but that's another story. But with this one extra session, on average, participants lost twice the weight over 2 months. And if you looked at 5% body weight, that increased from 8 to 54%. It's a tiny trial, but what it illustrates is that if you are precise in the way that you intervene, you can not only develop good behavior change intervention, but you can improve them. Because this is already a behavior change intervention where we're saying, well, if you look at that, you could add something to it that could really help people. And that's just the mediation analysis, which I wouldn't be so bold as to call a process analysis, but it's an attempt to show that the mechanism we were targeting, at least it's plausible that was the mechanism by which they lost more weight. This is a very brief point. I'm not going to dwell on it because I think it's probably, again, quite obvious. This, one of my PhD students, Ola Borak, developed this set of categories that we think you need to know about if you're to replicate a group-based behavior changes. Intervention. There are 26 about the effectiveness of group-based interventions in terms of weight loss. And what was staggering about it is the failure, our failure to be able to actually understand what on earth people are doing. So here's an illustration of this. So this is a graph that refers to 32 intervention descriptions. So that we've got these descriptions in front of us. Here's the 26 categories, and here's the number out of 32 of the papers that provided the information for the 26 core categories. So how would you read this? Well, you might say, oh, look, total number of sessions. That's really good. 30 out of 32 told us the number of sessions. But my reading of that is, how could you publish a paper on a group-based intervention and not tell the reader how many sessions? But if we come down to these things lower down, like, look at this. What were the mechanisms that by which the intervention was meant to work? Well, here we have 10 out of 32 that say anything about how the thing was supposed to work. So I think this is highly problematic. Sometimes when I show this slide, people go, oh, but it's all in supplementary materials. You read the supplementary materials of these papers, and I can tell you it's not in the supplementary materials. Because I agree that that's a problem with journal articles, but these days, digital journals, you can supply endless supplementary materials. So that's not the problem. But there's a huge problem here that this is just one illustration of, which is that we're not doing science. I'm sorry, me, if we're doing this. Like, my daughter's a chemist. They never publish anything unless they can replicate it 3 times independently. That's like before it's published. And when it's published, somebody else in another lab has to be able to replicate it. That's kind of the rules of chemistry. But that's the rules of science. But it's quite clear here that we're not playing by those rules. So this is a big problem, I think, in our science. And in fact, there was a time when I had more energy and enthusiasm when I wrote to journal editors, and we set up a group called Wider. And, if anybody's interested in making progress with this, there are quite good people who support it as well, like, what's the name of the editor of Addiction? Roberts. Will come to me. Yeah, Rob West, thank you. I mean, he said that if you publish an intervention in addiction, you have to publish a manual that shows somebody else how they can replicate it. And what we need is more journals to say if you're publishing an evaluation, you must have a replicability manual. And of course, what we then need is guidelines on how to write those manuals. But this could be fixed, and it would really help our science. Okay, moving on. So this is about, I'll move into this kind of taxonomy kind of part of the talk, because we thought people might be interested in this. So I'm quite skeptical about this work, even though I've done a lot of it. So that's what you'll see. This is my experience of reading intervention descriptions, and I have read so many that it's kind of a bit of a nightmare if I focus on it. But a lot of intervention descriptions, behavior change intervention descriptions, seem like this to me. People are describing things. There's lots of bits I can't see how it works. I don't know why that's there and why that's not there. And there's no explanation of the mechanism by which the thing operates. So I think there's a real problem, and I've already said that, made this point before. So part of this work was to help this. So one of the things that people like me and others are doing is we're looking at these descriptions and we're trying to take them apart and say, look, that description of that intervention has that feature, and so does that one and that one. So we put them over there in that pile. And these ones over here are not doing that. So if you take a very simple thing, these ones target social norms, these ones don't. So, like the leaflets. So that's kind of what people have been doing. And not many other people use the term, but I sometimes think of this as retrospective process evaluation. In other words, you haven't got a good process evaluation, but you have lots of studies, so you can begin to see what characteristics of interventions correlate with effect sizes. So there are many of these meta-analyses out there that do this. And how do we do it? Well, we start with categories. So this is a set of categories which I think at the time quite a few people liked. There are some real problems with these categories. These were always highlighted to be not techniques, but technique bundles. And I think there are some other definitional problems here that came to light after we published this. But here are some things that you might do in interventions. And since then, there's been a plethora of such taxonomies of categories published. We have lots. Oh yeah, well that's just, yeah. So specific goal planning, you know all about that, you know. So anyway, but here are some. These are just some. These are 4. These 4 I particularly use. But you'll see the numbers of techniques in these categories. And if you look at this, I'm not suggesting you do, but I do, what you find is that some of these categories run across. Some of them are slightly different across. And some of them are in one but not another. So you can end up with you could make a list of, say, a couple of hundred categories that people use in these kind of meta-analytic studies. So that's all out there. And, I think many of these categories are useful, but there are real problems with many of these categories. And this field needs to be revised, really. I'll give you an example. So this is an example of such a meta-analytic study by really quite leading people in the field in a good journal, yeah? So I'm not having a go at this paper when I say this. I just want using it to illustrate. So they used the taxonomy that I and Susan and other people kind of contributed to, this one with 93 techniques. That's the category list they used. And they found that of those 93, less than a quarter of the categories were any use to them when they categorized the intervention descriptions. They're actually looking at implementation interventions, but nonetheless. So of the 93, less than a quarter were helpful to them. Well, that's not a problem, that's fine. But it does show that the categories that are going to help you sort out your studies need to be study specific. Then they point out that for these interventions, the most commonly used categories were these ones I put in bold. And these ones are common to many of these taxonomies. They're pretty regular things in our interventions. But 3 of these were these categories, and they highlight these: restructuring the social environment, restructuring the physical environment, and adding objects to the environment. And I was part of the group that put these ideas together, but in retrospect, these categories are almost useless to us, because what do they say? Imagine I said to you, well, look, see this behavior change intervention you want to develop? What I suggest to you is, look, it's about people, it's about the environment, and it's about objects, okay? So good luck with that. They are so broad and so undiscriminating that they give you no useful information about the difference between intervention A and intervention B. So using these categories is quite problematic. And they very politely say, while you can use these categories, there may be a need to characterize what specifically is restructured. And, they're absolutely right. So we have a problem when we use categories that are too broad, because we're not actually looking at the kind of mechanistic and delivery distinctions that make a difference to our interventions. And this is quite problematic. This is a real example, which I'm not attributing to anybody, but here was an analysis, a meta-analysis, in which they looked at whether giving people accelerometers promoted physical activity. And when you count accelerometers with adding objects to the environment, you find no effect for them. So you could conclude that giving people accelerometers is ineffective. It doesn't promote effectiveness. But if you instead count them as prompt self-monitoring, that is, you focus on what they're actually doing for people, then because this category is much more specific than this, actually you find an effect. So the breadth of categories that you apply to this retrospective process evaluation, doing meta-analysis, determines your findings. And if you get the categories wrong, the findings of your meta-analysis can be misleading. So for example, we did one where we found that studies that reported training the facilitators of group-based interventions had lower effect sizes, significantly lower effect sizes than those that said that they trained their facilitators. Should we therefore conclude that when you're running behavior change and group-based interventions, you shouldn't train your facilitators? Well, obviously not. But the point is that you have to be very careful when you draw these conclusions doing this work. Here's an example I think really highlights it. These are both studies by my friend Pascal Sharon. They're both if-then planning studies, and they're both about getting people to appointments. Yep, I'm more or less on time. Great. So in this case, they were prompting people to make an appointment for cervical cancer screening. And you can see that they had a good effect of getting people to write down where, when, and how they'll make an appointment. In this case, people already had an appointment for psychotherapy, and here they wanted people to actually turn up for that appointment. Again, this is quite a good result. From a health service point of view, these are simple but really effective interventions. But here, people are given an instruction. As soon as I feel concerned about attending my appointment, I'll ignore that feeling and tell myself this is perfectly understandable. Are these the same type of intervention? They both use if-then planning. They're both about appointments. They're both led by Pascal Sharon. Are they the same? No. They're completely different because this is actually thought-stopping. This is intended to get people not to elaborate their anxieties. This has got nothing to do with thought-stopping. This is a specific planning intervention. What's the point? The point is you've got to be very careful about how you describe the mechanism if you're to begin categorizing interventions. And the same point I made earlier applies to how we design our interventions. So this, I'm just going to mention this. I'm not saying it's really useful to anybody, but we found it very useful. Simone Rodda and colleagues, we looked at gambling interventions. And what we found was when you use these taxonomies, there were lots of important parts of these interventions that the taxonomies didn't describe. So then we came up with a new set of categories which were particularly useful, we thought, to these type of interventions. So again, this is the same point. Specificity of categorization is critical if you're going to do this retrospective meta-analytic work. This is perhaps just worth mentioning briefly. When you do this work and you look at manuals and papers, these are two studies that have done this. So you've got the same intervention, and you have a manual here. It goes in the supplementary materials, and then you have the paper description, and then you do the categorization. What you find is that the manuals report many more techniques than the papers. You can see here 9 versus 6, and here in these, this is a different kind of scoring, 44 versus 18. So what this suggests too is that the descriptions in our journal articles underreport the content of our interventions. And that's highly problematic, again, for our science. So these are the points I've made. I've just said it all, so maybe I'll just leave that up there and stop. And very happy to talk about any of this. I'm sure a lot of it is kind of, yeah, we knew that. But I think that it's also an agenda as to how we could do this science better. And if any of you are interested in working with me to do that sort of work, I'm very keen to collaborate. Thank you.